I'll throw it open if anyone's got any questions or anything they want to share today. It's a general mentoring session, so any questions about anything, it's fine.
I'd like to find out, is the standing in the counsel of the Lord the same thing as going into the, there's a court of councils, right? Or court of counselors? Is that the same thing?
Not necessarily. It just depends on the context, really. I mean, there's a court of judges, and there's the court of 70, and there's also the court of the Lord. And I think the court of the Lord is really the Yasod of God, is really the council of God where destiny was agreed and various things. There's obviously court of kings and the court of the councils of the fathers, which are all different dynamics. The court of the councils of the fathers is where there's 24 elders are arranged around the throne of God, and you get assignments to be able to go to the other courts because they link to the 3 higher courts, and without going through that court you don't get access necessarily. And but there's all sorts of different dynamics, and I think it depends really on what happens when you go to one of those places, really, to determine where you are. Unless you're going specifically and you know you're going and therefore you know the way, then generally you get invited to go, or you access there as you're sort of led, or you end up there, or where is this place. I've found that when I've gone to the court of the councils of the fathers, they have given me a authorization to go further into the court of the 70 or court of judges. But that's my experience, but I'm, there may be many other ways of getting there.
I went somewhere and I could hear some things. And first I was shown, I was looking way down, and I believe it was the body of Christ. And it looked like salt and pepper. It was so far away, but there was more pepper than there was salt. And then I heard a couple of things said, and one was, there are no troops. And the other thing they said was, they're not sharing their water with each other. They should share their water with each other. Does that sound right?
Again, depends in whatever the context is. I mean, if you're looking at it from a heavenly perspective, and they're looking at a lack of, let's say, people sharing the good news with people, then that might be one way of looking at that. If that's what you heard, and you're looking down and seeing the world effectively, and probably seeing there's a whole load more people who don't know God yet than do, and probably saying, hey, people aren't sharing what they do have. Yeah. And I would say, essentially, when you're looking at the sort of the character, the nature of God and who he is, are we really sharing that as he really is? Or are we sharing religion?
Yeah.
If you look at the whole body and look at the whole sort of perspective, I mean, no, the individual people are sharing God and truth and everything, but generally, if you look at 7.5 billion people, or however many is, how many of them are sharing the truth of who God is, and that being living water? Not that many, I would think. So I would think that maybe that's a view of, hey, we're not really got our act together, and what religion is doing is definitely not offering the world a viable alternative to the following the DIY path of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I think we really need to look at how we engage God ourselves, and then how we express that in terms of love to the world around us. So that might be issue. I know when I went to the Court of the Council of Fathers, I was given a mandate then to go and present a case to the Court of the 70, really about the state of the church. Looking at it from that perspective was, is it governmental and is it serving? And very clearly it wasn't, which is why we need to see an end of an old Moses order of religion and mediatorial things, and a new way of engaging intimately, personally ourselves. Certainly, whatever we're doing is not effective,
Yes.
as it could be. And in one sense, you could say, hey, they have gone from 12 people to a lot more in the last 2,000 years, so there has been an increase. It's just when we look at it, actually, does it really look like what God intended it to look like? Are we really demonstrating what God's love really is? Is the world really looking at us and saying, wow, I want that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably, some of what heaven is feeling. But the only way we're going to be able to do anything about it is if we meet with God ourselves in such a way that it brings an unveiling to us of his true nature and character, and then we become conform to that. So we're sons. Our sonship demonstrates a true relationship with the Father, rather than the orphan spirit that's essentially prevailing. I would say in general, so many people have an orphan spirit because they don't really know the Father, and the God that they think they know isn't God at all, and they're generally afraid of him, rather than running into that place of intimacy and joy and love that he wants us to express. So many people are kept away from him because they are frightened of the angry, vengeful, judging God that's been presented, and that really isn't what he's like at all. But probably most of the world would see him that way through whatever religions, particularly the Judaistic religion. Certainly believes in the angry, vengeful God, as does the Muslim. Those that purport to believe in one God, and what we presented from a Christian perspective is not that much different. And you go through history and look at what we've done, look at how the church has been used to excuse atrocities and massacres and the Inquisition and the Crusades and on and on and on, really. And we're looking at sort of Muslims and saying, well, they're terrible. Well, we have a history of being just as terrible, and we're not going to win that war for hearts and minds by being the same spirit and looking for revenge or retribution against them. Jesus' whole model was forgiveness and forgiving those who are persecuting you and loving them. Turn the other cheek was definitely his way of making sure your heart is right when you engage people. And I don't think that's what's really been promoted by religion at all. It's been more of the vengeance and retribution and using an eye for an eye as our excuse. And it was never meant to represent God. It was a limitation on what humans could do to each other. It was never God saying you have to take an eye for an eye. It was saying you can't take any more than an eye. I want to limit your sense of justice and vengeance. It was never God saying this is how I want you to treat each other. And Jesus actually came and said, you've heard it said, you should hate your enemies. I say unto you, you need to love your enemies. Well, I think there's the answer really to loving one another. And I think sharing that living water is a description of rivers of living water flowing from our innermost being, bringing life wherever it goes. And if we just keep it to ourselves, it doesn't actually flow anywhere. Anyway, Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyone else got anything they want to throw into that or add to or share? Any other questions you want to look at?
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, Mike.
Hi, Pamela.
How you doing?
Good, thank you.
We're into our second demonstration group, and we've got two families that we're just really, it's a privilege to get to engage them, and we've constantly come up against this. So I'm going to put it out to you. I've been asking the Lord for strategies to help in what we can govern and what we can legislate in the heavenlies to ease this process. But these young adults are meeting God face to face, and God is healing them and restoring them, and there's just beautiful things that are happening. And what we're doing is we're meeting with them once a week, and we're asking them in the interim time to set apart that time with God and to meet with Him personally. You know, meeting with us once a week isn't going to sustain anybody. So, you know, I guess where I'm really, it's like my heart's hurting in that they're meeting God face to face on their own, and yet that hunger to cultivate that relationship just isn't sustaining. You know, it's not, I'm not seeing the hunger that I had hoped to see when you meet the living God for yourself, you know. And it's a beautiful thing that we're watching, and we're seeing transformation, but we're seeing that the world is so distracting, and these kids are being pulled in so many directions that they're not making that commitment to be alone with God. And just to set this up too, most of these kids have trust issues, and they've had to work through that. This is a posture of having to receive, and it's a very difficult thing for all of them to be able to do. So I'm asking the Lord, and I've got this before the bench, is how can we facilitate and ease that for them? And I don't have any clarity yet, and just wanted to put it out to you to see if there's anything that you can, you know, think of or put into that as to how we could govern better.
Okay. I mean, have you done a court case which looks specifically at the accusations that the enemy uses to distract? Because it's like what underlyingly gives the enemy some authority to do that, or culture, or whatever it is that's affecting them.
I'd say it's more culture.
Yeah.
You know, they've been running for 30 years.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of old house, old patterns, old ways, and the flesh not wanting to give up control.
Yeah. I mean, looking at it from our own lives, without all the potential hindrances that these guys are facing, we struggled to do the same. You know, how many believers spend intimacy with God because of desire and hunger? You know, we're just seeing the tip of a few of those people, but underneath, you know, you look at the religious system and you see an obligation and a duty, but not an awful lot of desire or hunger or passion. So, you know, if it's so difficult even for believers who don't have necessarily those specific problems, you know, those who do, you know, it's an even greater challenge. So it's not easy. Yeah, and why it's not easy? Well, yes, there's all the cultural stuff, which maybe they find it difficult to sift out. But then, as I say, so does everyone else, I think. You know, what do we need? Well, if it's a issue of the culture that they live in, then how do we get them out of that culture? It's a real difficult one, because sometimes it comes down to choice, doesn't it? And if it's hard to make a choice, then you have to be able to try and facilitate people to make that choice in a different way. And I would say, you know, the legislative, governmental aspect of it, I wouldn't throw out the idea that the enemy is behind culture, because we know the enemy wants to use everything that there is out there set up against the knowledge of God to distract people. So, you know, the lofty things and the things that get in the way, and all those things which, you know, we are all faced with, I would say that the enemy is behind a lot of that, even though it may not be overt. It's certainly there behind the scenes. You know, I would look at maybe doing a court case just on distraction, yeah, and look for what are the accusations or the legal rights that the enemy uses for distraction, and that may lift up all sorts of potential areas of authority, you know, the media, entertainment, you know, money, all sorts of things which potentially are in the way. And, you know, how do we change society? You know, how do we change the culture? Well, we have to change. You know, it starts with the household of God. And I think judgment always starts with the household of God. Therefore, it starts with me. How do I deal with distractions in my own life? You know, am I still distracted? Because if I'm still distracted, then I have less authority in dealing with other people who are distracted. So I think it's almost like, okay, I'm going to go and look at my own life first, and I'm going to start in Jerusalem, you know, figuratively, and I'm going to look, what influences am I under that cause me to be distracted from the real key issues of relationship with God? You know, if I start with me, then I can see that expand outwards. So you could then start with the bench of three coming together, perhaps, and looking at, well, how are we distracted? What are our eyes looking at? And how do we take our eye off the goal at times? And then take it out a little bit further, looking at, if I don't start with me, then I then don't have authority any further. So if it's a cultural issue, which is general, which I would say it is, you know, so many people are so busy and so filled with all sorts of things in the world that they use that as their seeking those things first. You know, and for a lot of people, that is the drive for money or security or position or power. And for other people, it's for entertainment or pleasure or leisure or other things which take a focus. You know, where are we in that scale? And if we deal with things in us, and we may be a fair way from that ourselves, but there are probably still things in our lives which distract us. Lack of peace, lack of rest, striving, you know, some of those things. And I would say start there and then begin to expand outwards, taking into count the particular places. And I think, you know, does the enemy have a strategy to distract us from God? Yeah, without a doubt. And if you look at Jesus talking to people, calling them into discipleship, what was some of their responses? Well, I've got some yoke of oxen that I need to go back and attend to. Well, no, I've got a funeral I need to go to. Yeah, I've got all this stuff. Well, you know, maybe later. You know, and you know, you had the rich young Euler. Well, what's stopping me? Engage. Well, give everything you've got away. So give all those things that are your priority away, because Jesus really put his finger on the root issues in people, and that brought those things to the surface. You know, I will be looking at, okay, what are those things that are in our modern thing? There aren't going to be too many people who've got a yoke of oxen they've got to go and deal with, but you know, they may have other equivalents which are things that are first. So are there any priorities in my own life which are preeminent? And I think, you can't answer the question from a, well, I know already perspective. You've got to look at it from, oh, what don't I see? You know, what don't I see operating in my own life or within this group that I want to be able to see and unveil and understand, and look at it from an unveiling or a revealing with some wisdom into there. But, you know, it's in a lot of these things, I know there are no simple answers, because life is complex and there is a mixture of all sorts of things which we have to, in a sense, unpack. But, you know, keep going for it, and, you know, just, you know, probably be more specific in what you're doing in seeking for answers with God, or for, you know, in a court case, you know, be specific. You know, tackle a point and then see if there are other points that potentially come out from that.
Yeah, that's great. That's great wisdom.
Okay.
I appreciate that. We'll take that to the Lord, and you know, we have to look here first, because, you know, God draws all men unto himself, and if they're not seeing that in us, what would make them want that? And we do see the want in their eyes. We see the you know, the wonderment of that, but it seems so far away for them, you know, to be able to live that life in him, you know, safe and at peace. And I mean, we're hopeful. We want to know that we're doing everything we can to help them, and we want to help them establish relationship before we kind of get into the responsibility side of things, because people they feel safer doing the responsibility part in their own mind, in their own strength. And so we're really asking the Lord for wisdom there as to how not to step into that, so we don't put them into works, or, you know, put them into their self. So yeah, it's really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think looking at the relationship aspect of things, sometimes that can be so broad that it's quite difficult to connect to. So maybe, you know, in the situations that you're facing with people, looking maybe to focus on the key areas in their lives to engage God in, rather than just the general experiencing God. What about experiencing God in this situation, this way of thinking, this behavior pattern? You know, break it down into sort of bite-sized chunks, so that they can sort of engage in the specific rather than in the general. And then that may then reveal, hey, has met them in that, it's changed that area. And then you can then look at another area, because you need momentum to be built, and a shift through testimony that then leads on to further things. And, you know, sometimes it helps to break things down into a very defined packet, if you like, and let's deal with this, and let's see if God focused in engaging those people in that area before you move on to something else, or that it's so general that they may have an experience of God, but it isn't relatable to a particular issue in their life, or a particular problem, or a particular way of thinking about stuff. And if you can target it at a particular thing, then it becomes a more focused testimony of, yeah, God changed that. I am different in that area. I may still have all these other areas, but in that area I'm different. And then that introduces hope for change in other areas. And it's almost like being faithful with little and going for the little then releases more. And, you know, when people are, you know, struggle to maybe see the bigger picture, you know, breaking it down into a little piece that they can see may well be helpful. So you can look at what you think, or even ask God, what are the major issues here that we can actually break down into those smaller packets, and then let's focus on God meeting them in that small need. And it might be, you know, it may even a very small thing, but every breakthrough starts with, you know, something small. And everything, then can go further once you get that initial breakthrough.
We have seen that, and we have seen, I mean, honestly, what would be considered parting of the Red Sea in some situations in their life.
Yeah.
And that is true of 3 of the 4, that they've had those, and they've seen a significant difference in their lives. And so maybe I'm just getting impatient too, but I want it for them now.
Yeah.
But we could do more to break it down in practical everyday living, probably for them too, as to how do you bring God into that, on a daily basis. And so out of such wisdom, thank you. Yes.
And it is practicing God's presence in those everyday things, whereas there may be still a feeling, well, God is somewhere and he comes and he meets with me at times, but then where is he now in this? And encouraging well, God is with us, in us all the time, and we're all in this little area, or this very little practical thing of bringing God into it. I always remember the sort of the practicing the presence of God, this Brother Lawrence thing, where he would just recenter himself every period of time to remind himself that God was with him, and he was consciously aware of that while he was doing menial tasks, while he was doing his duties within the monastery. He broke it down back to remembering, well, God is with me, while I'm doing the dishes, or while I'm doing this, or while I'm looking at tidying my clothes, or looking after my room, or whatever I might be doing. Actually, God's with me in those little tasks. And if I can become conscious of that, then I become more aware, and then the desire for the outworking of that becomes greater. And I did that in my own life. When I was really looking to keep focusing and with God, I used to set my watch to the hourly beep chime thing. And every time it would beep, I would just recenter my focus, begin to engage him for a few moments, just start to draw that, so that I became conscious of it. And I practiced that until now. I'm totally flowing in it, but I used to do it, consistently to bring that consciousness of God's presence and the awareness in the little things. And it's in the little things, because we spend most of our time doing little things, and most of those things seem quite mundane, in which almost like, well, we don't really need God in that, do we? Surely I can just do this anyway. Whereas if we leave him out of our thoughts in it, then we're not conscious of him while we're just living life. And I think what you're trying to do is help them to live their life in a conscious awareness of God's presence, and therefore he's always there. When some emotional thing erupts, or when something else erupts, he's there. And they don't have to be, God, where are you? You're out there somewhere. He's there, So, yeah. Okay. Anything else? No other questions or things you want to talk about?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, I was just wanting to encourage Pamela to do what you said about going to the courts, because I recently, several of us recently did this for a 23-year-old who is very wired in, or was very wired into video games and this culture. And when we went into the courts, we saw that when the accusers came to see why, you know, he was stuck in this, because he was a born again Christian and on fire for the Lord, but then when he got injured and then he couldn't work, and so that pushed him or drew him back into video games, and it happened like twice to him. And so it was like, so we took it to the court, and there was when the accusers came in, there was a big old demon. He was hairy and brown, light brown and shaggy looking, and he was called Spirit of Bondage. And so the spirit of bondage, from what I understand, is the strong man over addictions. And so then, when as we went further along, we saw the cords connected to that spirit of bondage and this person. And this angel came in and cut those cords. And then the Lord judged the situation, and then or judged the demons, and then we were told to wait 3 days. And so on the third day, absolutely, this person totally transformed, was a total different person, threw away his mouse so he couldn't get back on the video games, and just did a total turnaround. It was just awesome to watch. Now, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, I mean, this person also just started saying, I want to, you know, see more in the spirit, you know, and just was totally on fire. Okay, so then he got hurt again. Okay, and I had warned him. I said, you know, this is like a test for you. So this is probably going to, you know, happen if this happens again. You know, you got to make the right choices. So, yeah, he's back into video games right now. So he made the choice to be distracted and to be, you know, to fill his mind, since he can't work, to fill his mind with something. So I'm thinking we're going to either have to go to court again, because he opened the doors back up. I don't know what to do, really. I think, you know, I can counsel him, but...
Sure, yeah. I mean, whatever you do in a court case for somebody else, you don't have the same level of authority that they have in their own life. And you can only prepare the way for a choice to be made. You can't make it for people. And though some people find it harder, seemingly, to choose the right things, you know, even after having amazing encounters, and in a sense, you know, you can't force something, you can't manipulate someone's will. They have to want to choose, and sometimes, you know, they have to get to a point where everything else fails, everything else falls apart. I mean, sometimes that's what happens with people particularly with bondage to certain things and addictions. You know, it's almost like they have to come to an end of themselves and their own ability before they ultimately break free. We obviously work with a lot of people with addictions, and the mindsets of addiction, and the systems in people's minds of why and how they get addicted, and how those addictive choices operate, you know, is a complex thing. But when you do a court case, yes, you can stand on behalf of a person, but that person ultimately has to come into agreement and ultimately stand there for themselves. You know, you would want eventually everyone to be able to say, I'm going to stand and face these things in my own life, and I'm going to receive the verdict, and then I'm going to use the verdict. And you know, that might be what you need to do with people if they're open to, you know, engage them in the court. You know, help them to hear the accusations against them rather than necessarily doing it on their behalf. You can facilitate the thing, but then if they hear the accusations themselves, then they're much more likely to take it seriously than if it's just, well, we're telling them what we feel God said or what we heard. I mean, we did court cases on behalf of people, and then we told them, because they weren't in a place to be able to do one themselves, then we told them, well, this is the accusations, and they just wouldn't own them. You know, even though, you know, they'd seen a breakthrough because of what we did, when it then came to living that consistently, they refused to own it because they didn't want to admit that they were wrong, or they were thinking that way, or they didn't want the shame of, you know, but thinking people thought that way about them. And for whatever reason, they wouldn't accept the accusation and then go back and own it. So effectively, that's all we could do. You know, they had to then do it. And because they wouldn't, I mean, one person, you know, we saw come out of a critical care condition, you know, being told really they were going to die. We did a court case. You know, then the person came out of hospital really quickly. God, it was a supernatural thing. And then it was like, okay, here's the accusations who we heard for you when we did this, and she just wouldn't accept it. Because a lot of it meant lifestyle changes. It meant her owning and facing her eating disorders, her, you know, way of looking at herself, her value and worth from that perspective. And she wasn't prepared to do it. And in the end, she left. She left because she couldn't face people knowing that those were accusations. It was a bizarre situation, rather than just saying, hey, yeah, I'll work through this. And she didn't, you know. And ultimately that creates a dynamic where you cannot stand in the gap for someone who won't take responsibility. If they can take responsibility, that's a different thing. But if they won't take responsibility, you know, you're limited in what you can do. And sometimes you have to basically face people with that. Because, you know, in Romans, you know, God does at times allow people to suffer the consequences of their choices and decisions, so that they will realize that by making those decisions, they have effectively negatively allowed things into their own life. And, you know, it's not easy to watch that. You know, when you deal with people with addictions and various things, you know, it's so hard not to enable, and to enable others by doing things for them. And you have to get a point where, I know, you know, and we work with people, with parents who've got addicted children and various things, and it's so hard for a parent to stop enabling their child because they love them and they don't want to see any harm come to them. But enabling never promotes change. It promotes staying where people are. And sometimes you just have to say, okay, we're going to hand this situation over to God, and we're going to ask God to, you know, deal with it. And that's not always, you know, his way of dealing with it is not always what we would necessarily want, but he knows the best way of bringing people to a place of choice and decision. And most people don't make decisions to change when they don't have to. You know, change is not something that most people want or are willing to work through. So sometimes it's like the conditions have to get so bad that someone wants out of the conditions, and that's never easy to watch. Or be part of in someone's situation. But we have seen restoration take place when you've let someone go and then they have come to their senses. It's a little bit like the prodigal son. The father is not bringing any condemnation, but he allowed the son to go, and he allowed the son to waste all his money, and he allowed the son to end up eating with the pigs. And then when he came back, he totally embraced him and restored him. But he did allow him to take his own path. But that path obviously ended up in a place where eventually the guy came to his senses and realized, what am I doing? But that doesn't often happen where people are comfortable where they are, and they have to get uncomfortable. But, yeah.
Can I chime in a little?
Yeah, sure.
I have also seen, I just want to say, he is altogether trustworthy. I have seen in times when I just like, Lord, I want to quit. I'm not making a difference. I prefer my monk life, one-on-one intimacy with you. And I've seen him, just to prove a point that he didn't need me to get it done. One who wasn't down and out, who was very comfortable, lay his hand on their chest, and someone who had no real understanding of who he was, lay his hand on their chest and prophesy and all of that, and then come to me and say, I can do it by myself. I just choose you doing it with me. I don't require your help. I just enjoy your help. Don't quit. Keep working with me, but I don't need any of you to get this done. And he's just altogether trustworthy. There are the courts, and then there's the throne of grace. And then there's your love seat in your garden where you can sit. There are many ways to get the king act. I mean, you have a judge on a judgment seat, but then you have a king too, if that makes sense. It's not just the one way. Try them all. Just sit intimately with him and try them all. He doesn't need us. He just chooses us to co-labor, if that makes sense. That's what he told me.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, he does. I don't know if that helps. Just
sure.
Trust in his trustworthiness.
Yeah.
Faith.
Yeah. And I would say, at times we got to be careful that we don't carry the weight of responsibility for someone else. Yeah. It's like having the compassion of God and seeing people through God's eyes is great. But it's not so good when we empathize to such a degree that we're carrying people's pain and burdens and things. And that's obviously not a good place to be. And, in essence, God is the only one who can actually bring freedom into people's lives. It's great when we're involved and we can see it, but, ultimately it is a person and their relationship with God, which is what is going to eventually work, no matter what we do or don't do. But we've got to be willing to do whatever God says or stop doing things when he says. I mean, when we were working with addictions first going off, it was so hard to not take people's failures onto yourself. I can remember when the first person that I was ministering to with an addiction and just essentially befriending them and sharing stuff with them and trying to help them. I remember having a conversation with them, and it was very, very sort of real conversation about where they really were. And then the next day they were dead. They died of an overdose that night. And I was like, what did I do? What didn't I do? What should I have done? What shouldn't I have done? What should I have done better? And we had to learn you just can't carry someone else's responsibility, or if they chose to do that, it is terribly sad. You know, we end up with, you know, often going to lots of funerals from people who make choices to carry on in their lifestyles, and it's not an easy thing, but it is their choice. And I learned a long time ago just to let that go. I had to hand it over to God. I'm not going to carry someone else's choice. I'm not going to carry their blame or the responsibility for what's happened. You know, and you can carry my sorrow in this situation. You know, but not easy. These things are not easy. They are very much emotional things. When you're involved emotionally in people's lives and you want the best for them and you desire that they will have breakthroughs, but we have to come from a place of rest in God ourselves. Otherwise we will bring tension and striving into a situation, rather than being at peace, being at rest, and trusting in God's trustworthiness and in his ability. But God himself will not force himself on anybody. You know, he can't force love. Love that's demanded isn't love, you know, and God wants a relationship which is voluntary by choice and desire, not one which is obligated, legalistic, or in any way coming from a perspective of works, you know. And you know, everyone has to come to that themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the greatest thing that we can do is to just go with them by the hand into his presence and let them meet him face to face, and and love them. It's sad, but we have a culture where that love is so twisted and perverse that we have a culture of people that, you know, don't know or understand unconditional love.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, you can't force that. And love, really, I love what you just said, that it's a choice, and that's true love. And so all we can do, really, I think, is help people meet that unconditional, meet him. But I do want to glean from, and thank you, Paula, for what you said. I appreciate that, because I do want to go and explore with the Lord about distractions, you know, understanding that we would be the front line for that. Understanding that what we're distracted by would be addressed first. And but that's a great place to start.
Yeah. And you know, I love the fact that the closer I get to God and the more I experience and feel his love, the more I realize how he loves other people. I mean, it's just, you know, that's what comes out. This just love just emanates from him towards everyone. Even the worst of the worst in our eyes to him are the best of the best. He doesn't see any of us different. You know, he doesn't see Billy Graham as different to some, you know, Muslim jihadists. He still sees them equally as valuable, equally created for relationship, equally having his love expressed towards them. They just don't know that love. You know, they've not learned to tune into it. And I think that's what we really need to try and help people to discover, that they don't have to do something for God to love them. He loves them already. And no matter what they do won't affect how he feels about them, but very much affects how we feel about him. You know, we're the ones who feel separated and distanced from him because of our behavior. He never moves. You know, he loves everyone equally and with as much passion. You know, and his passion is expressed into our lives in ways which are beyond our ability sometimes to understand or see, but he's there. You know, and when I've looked into his heart, and when I've seen how he feels about people, you know, in a sense, sort of, it makes me feel the only way we're going to reach the world is through that type of otherly, self-giving, love. We're not going to do it through any other way. So we've got to find a way of demonstrating that, of living that. And for that, we need to live love first. If we don't live love, we won't be able to live loving. And that's the key to everything. It's like, I must look at me, and I must look at my own life for that then to be expressed outwards. It has to come out from what's in the center, and that's the intimacy of the joy of my relationship with him, which really expresses love at a deeper and deeper and deeper level. Is inexhaustible. I mean, his love is totally inexhaustible and unbounded, and more than we could ever and possibly imagine or think, and then more after that, and more after that. So it's great. Okay, all right, I better leave.